The Underground Railroad by Brianna Creel. The Underground Railroad was a big, huge idea that happened from the slaves, because this helped many of the slaves escape from their owners and the abusers that the slaves had escaped from throughout the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a place where the slaves hid from their owners. The slaves had disappeared from their owners that had messed with them and made them slaves. The Underground Railroad was a big point in history that had been done. The Underground Railroad was a hideout for the slaves that wanted to get away from the owners and have the freedom that they had always deserved. The Underground Railroad had started in Ohio by the Ohio River and grew out through these places in the 1800s and nearly grew around Canada, north of the United States, happening in 1899. The Underground Railroad was a place that helped the slaves hide out from the white government. The Underground Railroad was also a place where the slaves would escape from their owners because the slaves were done and were trying to get and receive their freedom anyway from the bad treatment of the owners that had been very mean and rude, and some even beat their slaves. So this was a place where the slaves could escape. Who started the Underground Railroad, you ask? Well, the 18th century Quakers were the first organized abolitionists. They believed that slavery had violated the Christian principles, meaning that everyone was equal and no one should ever be treated the way that they do now, where they aren't equal, which led them to make the Underground Railroad for the slaves. This showed that people had led them in the Underground Railroad were called conductors that led that. Those who hid slaves in their house, they were called station masters. So, for this, the Quakers had thought in a different way than the whites, and they thought that this was wrong on what the whites were doing. So the Quakers had found a solution to get the tragedy of the slaves' freedom that wasn't there. The Underground Railroad was used and established by many people. Harriet Tubman led 15 trips to the South and gained hundreds of black freedom from using the Underground Railroad. Frederick Douglass had known many of the stations. William Wells Brown carried 69 fugitive slaves on the steamboat to Canada. James and Elber Pettit established some stations along Lake Erie, shoreline of West New York. Margaret was born on a slave ship and was working no matter what, even if she was pregnant. The Underground Railroad was a railroad that slaves from this time could be free and run away from their slave owners. The theft of self in face of justice laws, the combination of black and whites rescue the enslaved defiance of the law. This was humanity joined together against humanity. There was people who had saved and they held the slaves in their homes called station masters. The Underground Railroad had changed the slaves that escaped life, and this had showed the integrity of the people that hid them, called station masters, that had his and fed them until they were ready to go. This showed the integrity of the conductors that led the slaves and helped them escape from their owners to the Underground Railroad. They just were very helpful to the slaves that had wanted to escape from their owners. The Underground Railroad has caused change in many different ways. One way that this caused change was because when the slaves had affected the way that the slaves have had escaped from their owners. The Underground Railroad had caused change from showing the importance of what the Quakers and the blacks had felt on the way of freedom. This helped the slaves get away from their owners that had done and gone through to get and run away to the Underground Railroad. The people that had led them in the Underground Railroad were called conductors. Those who hid the slaves in their homes or anywhere else were called station masters. This event caused change by the way that this helped the slaves escape from their owners. This also had helped the way the slaves move around. The slaves got to escape from their owners from their places. The Underground Railroad had changed the slaves' lives because the slaves had escaped and they didn't have to be treated like dirt and traded for money to sell a person. It has also changed American history because then we would have now been racist and different races would have to be put in different schools. And places like the colored were not good enough for the whites.